Got a short episode for you today. I'm going to do a repair on a gun stock. If you're a regular to the channel, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, give it a thumbs up, make a comment. All that stuff is great for the YouTube algorithms. It helps tell YouTube that the content is interesting and they'll share it with more people, helping the channel to grow faster. Quick update on the Winchester 94 restoration. It's all done. I've got to put the gun back together, and when I've got that done, I'll do a beginning to end video showing the entire process. That should come out sometime in the next several days or a week. This came out stunning, and I want to show this to all of you. For today's episode, this is a Ruger 44 Carbine gun stock. Those of you that are familiar with it, Ruger no longer makes this gun, and when we refer to this, we literally call this the Carbine. I know Ruger's made a couple other versions of this, but this is the real deal. This is the one that everybody likes and desires. I have to repair a crack in this, and the crack is right along in this area right here. This is typical. I'll show you a close-up of this as we get started on this. This happens a lot to these stocks, and there are several reasons or causes for it. But completely, one of the biggest problems is that this web on the bottom is extremely thin. It's 270-75 thousandths, depending on how much they sanded off when it was made. So it's really thin and pretty fragile if the things aren't kept up correctly. Some of the reasons for it are generally or usually it's just weather or humidity conditions. If these stocks exist in a climate where it goes from humid to dry, like in the Northeast, these things do tend to crack, and they almost always crack either on this side or this side, and it's typical, and we've fixed many of these over the years. If the repair is done well, they don't come back. So this is something we've done a lot of, and this won't be a hard one to repair. It's interesting that when I first went to Ruger back in the mid-70s, I was a machine operator in the wood shop. And back in the day, the wood shop was a true wood shop. It's what you would expect. Joiners, planers, bandsaws, routers, you name it, all that stuff was there. And today it's a shadow of that. Almost everything's done on CNC now, and a lot of the wood comes in pre-prepared for going right into the CNCs. Back in the day, we received raw lumber from the mills, and then we had to do all the work from templating out the blanks to bandsawing them to putting them in the lathes. We did it all, and it was an exciting place to work back in those days. It's interesting that back in the day when we made these all on hand routers. Now, not the kind of hand router that you would see in your home shop or you would buy in Lowe's or Home Depot. These were industrial hand routers that were made specifically for making gun stocks, and they were built by J.S. Richardson. Anyway, so we literally would clamp these gun stocks into a fixture that was mounted to these routers, and we would grab these huge handles, and we would follow these templates or follow these tracer bars, and in following the tracer bars, the cutters would go down inside of the wood, and we would inlet all of this stuff by hand. It was a lot of work. It was a physical job, but it was really rewarding. One of the problems with doing that is there were a lot of stresses put on the wood, the way we were inletting it, and we learned to do this really well. I still believe all these years later that we were one of the best wood shops, stock making shops in the industry. You can argue that, and I'm all good with that, but that's my personal belief. Anyway, so we made these things for years. Finally, towards the end of this production, they went on to, initially Ruger bought NC machines or tape control machines. Those were always interesting machines because if you have any experience with it, if you're old enough, these were all Mylar tapes. The early ones were paper tapes, but we transfer it to Mylar. And if the cog hole got off a little bit, or if the hole that gave the command got off a little bit, these machines would do some really funky things and sparks would fly. We eventually converted them all to CNC machines, numerical control machines. And as we moved forward in time, Ruger bought more and more of these NC machines. And then at the end of this production, a lot of this work was being done on the CNCs as opposed to the hand routers. We still did a lot of work on the hand routers, but a good bulk of the main inlighting was being done on those CNCs. Anyway, all that story out of the way, let's go ahead and get this thing repaired. I've moved over to the woodworking bench to do this repair, and we're going to use a simple two-part epoxy. And you need to be sure, if you do any kind of a repair like this, that you're using a 12 or 24-hour cure epoxy, and you don't want to use the 5-minute epoxy. There's several reasons for it, but first off, you're going to need some open time, and the open time is the work time, or how long the epoxy doesn't activate, so that you have time to get it into the crack, do whatever clamping that you need to do, and then wipe off any of that excess. And if you use the 5-minute epoxy, it's going to start hardening before you get the job done. So you want to make sure that you're using the 12 or 24-hour epoxy. I use clear in this case because I don't want this to show. The seam on this is really very, very tight. You're going to get some line will show. And depending on what the customer wants, ultimately, whether I paint that out or just leave it alone, I'm thinking we're just going to leave it alone. It is a repair. You could also use a dark or wood tone epoxy. In this case, I don't want to do that because I really don't want that line, that hard line that the colored epoxy would leave. So I'm using the clear. The first thing I need to do is to open up that crack, and I need to be careful doing that because I need to open it up or spread it out so that I can get my epoxy down into there. But I don't want to open it up so much that I'm actually beginning to extend that crack longer up the stock. So you need to just be patient and careful while you're doing that. In this case, I'm going to use a wedge that I made out of softwood, and I use these wedges for a lot of things, but it's going to come in handy for this. Using the wedge, I'm going to simply push it down in and gently persuade this stock to open up. Again, trying not to split it any more than it already is. Just kind of a feel thing. And when you've gotten that stock opened up a good, I'm going to guess maybe 25 thousandths at the widest point, I think you're going to be good enough for getting that epoxy down in. This is a two-part epoxy. Real simple to use. You're just going to mix equal amounts of both, which is typical. One thing I do is I use denatured alcohol. So once I've used the chemical, I like to wipe it off with the ends of this off with denatured alcohol. And it sort of protects the threads from getting all gummed up. I have these little spatulas that I bought years ago, and I use these to mix with. don't be afraid to spend a little extra time stirring it up, because you want to make sure that the two halves of the epoxy are thoroughly mixed. Now, as I said, using the 12 or 24-hour epoxy gives you a lot of open time, a lot of time to work with the repair before it starts to harden or crystallize. Alright, so we're going to start pushing this down inside this crack. And literally that's what we're going to do. We need to get the epoxy so that it's far down in there as it can go, because we want to make sure we're coating as much of the sides of the wood in the crack as we can. I'm going to turn it over and come in from the other side as well. You're not going to be able to see this because it's dark down inside this stock. I have my little X-Acto knife, which is a thin blade, and I can use that to help force that down inside the crack. I mentioned the denatured alcohol, and you want to get down inside and take all that excess off, or as much of it as you can, because when you squeeze it out, you're going to have more in there that it's going to squeeze out, and you want this repair to look as clean as you can get it. Just keep pushing it in. You'll reach a point where you're happy with it. All right, I'm happy with it. When we get to the point where we're happy with it, we're going to remove that wedge. And when I remove the wedge, what's going to happen is the stock is going to squeeze in, and then it'll squeeze out some of that epoxy, which is a good thing. And it squeezed it out on the inside as well, which means I got it in there about as good as I'm going to be able to. Once again, we need to clean this up, because we don't want the epoxy interfering with the finish. Now, I could have used wood glue. Wood glue is, the proper wood glue is pretty strong. Trouble with wood glue is it requires a significant amount of pressure in order to make the wood glue function the way it's supposed to, and I don't want to use a lot of pressure on this. So I am going to use a clamp on the repair. However, when I clamp it, I want to be sure that I'm not, again, putting too much pressure on, because epoxy doesn't require a high amount of pressure, but I want enough pressure on it to close up that gap. But because this is so thin down here, and because this is all cut out and open, I want to be careful that when I put the clamp on, that when I squeeze this, literally if I squeeze at this point, I could open that crack back up and not close it up like the intention is. So I'm going to have to fill in. So I have a couple wooden blocks that I'm going to use to fill up that space and get this, as snug as I can get it. because I want, again, I don't want this squeezing in on me. All right, I'll keep that. And then we'll use our seat clamp or our wood clamp or bar clamp to try and bring that in. And the nice thing about this is, as I said, the crack is really very fine, so I'm not having to, oh, that's nice. I wish the camera could pick that up. I'll try and get you a close-up. That's squeezing out nice. Oh, that's so nice. All right, perfect. So by getting this bar clamp as close to the edge itself and trying not to go over the side where the inletting is or where the inletting has that gap or opening, you can see that we have, I'm hoping you can see that it's showing up a little bit as a shiny line, but that's actually the epoxy that's being squeezed out, and it literally closes up that gap almost completely, which is what I'm hoping to get. Last thing I have to do is clean out the balance of that epoxy so that it doesn't show up. So that's done. We need to wait 24 hours for the epoxy to harden. We'll come back in another day and take a look at it and make sure it's done what we want it to do. I'm also probably going to have to do a little bit of restoration work in that finish because unfortunately the denatured alcohol or even the mineral spirits tend to glaze over the original finish. We'll see. We'll see what that looks like once I get to work it here just a little bit, and I may have to just put a thin coat of finish on it and just buff that off to blend it in. But it should come out really nice. All right. See you guys tomorrow. All right, it's the next day. Let's get the clamp off and see how this repair looks. So the repair is virtually gone. I mean, you can see that crack, but I can't feel the crack. So the epoxy's done what it's supposed to do. On the bottom, I've got a little bit of stuff. I think I'm just going to leave it there. I don't think it'll hurt anything. Have to remove some of that epoxy that ran over down inside here. But it looks good, and let me give you a close-up of this. So you can see there's a slight line right in there, but I think it's going to look fine. I am going to have to put a small thin coat of finish over this because, as I said yesterday, the denatured alcohol or the thinner tends to cloud the finish a little bit. So I've mixed up a really thin coat of finish that I can just brush over that really quickly, and it'll match the rest of the finish on the gun. The gun is used, not abused, but it is used. So there are certain conditions of the stock that you would expect to see, and when I get the finish on, that will virtually disappear. So, all right, so I've mixed up a batch of my secret sauce finishes that I've mixed to sort of mimic the original factory finishes, and I want to get that on. I'm only going to put one thin coat on it because most of that original finish has remained intact. I just want to cover up that cloudiness. And one thing that I think is going to happen is when I put the finish on it, I'm pretty sure it's going to help blend in that crack a little bit more. It'll never make it disappear, but it'll be damn hard to see it. The reason for that is that epoxy has a little bit of a shine to it, and by adding the finish will bring up the gloss, bring up the luster, and will help to make that epoxy line disappeared just a little bit more. So let's do that. Let's put on some of that finish. All right, we're going to give that about an hour to set up, and we'll put on another coat. And the crack doesn't completely disappear, but as I said, this was supposed to be a repair, not a restoration. So I'm happy with it. I think the customer will be happy with it as well. So let me get the final finish on, then we'll come back and we'll close this video out. So I decided to go in with some touch-up markers and try to take away a little bit of that shininess from that patch. And that just helps blend in that epoxy line a little bit more like the regular wood. These repair markers are really pretty nice. They work pretty well. You just need to work slowly with them. Not put a lot on. And try to concentrate it in the areas specifically that you're trying to repair. Put a little on and just sort of wipe it through. Again, you don't want, if it's done well, it sort of mimics a grain line, or yeah, it sort of mimics a grain line. The patch is still there, the repair is still there, but it doesn't scream out at you saying, "Look at me." All right, looks good. Let's give that ink and that marker a little time to set up, and then we'll put the final coat of finish over it. All right, that went really well. You need to remember that this was a repair and it wasn't a restoration. When you work with your customers, you want to really try and fully understand what are their expectations. And in this case, the customer wanted this to be repaired so he could put it back on the gun and the gun would function. He wasn't looking to do a full restoration, to strip it, to do all those things that would bring this back to an original state. And I'm actually pleased with that. So he was looking just simply to repair this crack so that the gun would function, and we've done that. I may have gone a little bit further by trying to color out that epoxy line, but it's all good, man. I mean, it's all good. So it's done. It looks great. I'm happy with it. I think the customer will be happy with it. Be sure and give it a thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ring that bell so you get notified the next time I post a video. If you haven't, please consider heading over to my Patreon page and signing up and supporting the channel there. If that's something you're inclined to do, I would really appreciate that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.